All righty. We're good. AJ, can you see like the actual slide? It says Leviticus, priest and priestly literature.
Yeah, I can.
Great. All right. Susan. Hello, good to see you too. All right, so this is for folks who may be taking the ordination exam for the PCUSA, or people who are super into Leviticus, which I know is everybody. So that's probably why most people are on the call. In any event, this is designed to help you get your grounding in the book of Leviticus. We don't know what text it's going to be yet, so this is a basic primer and like the background, what this text is, how it works, who wrote it, or at least who wrote what parts of it, and so on. So I'm going to start with a prayer. This is, it's a good thing to start with if you're in the priestly literature, the priest-like prayers. But there's one prayer in particular, not in Leviticus, but it's in Numbers, and it's the priestly benediction. This is a P text or a priestly text. This is the oldest biblical text we've got as well. It's on the Ketef Hinnom amulets. They were found outside of Jerusalem in the grave sometime around 700 BCE. They were written. This is the oldest biblical text we've got. Now you can find it in Numbers chapter 6, verses 22 through 26. And it goes like this. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the Israelites, and you shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make the divine face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the divine countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. All right. So we'll talk about Leviticus 1 through 27, all takes place in one place at one time. One of the few biblical books that doesn't change location. So it's all spoken from beginning to end on the mountain. It's given as direct instruction to Moses, for Moses to give to Aaron and Aaron's sons. We'll get to who that is in a minute. And then eventually it'll filter down some of it to the people. But this is direct conversation between God and Moses that occurs in the midst of the large, what we call the Sinai pericope, or the big bunch of texts that deals with them actually at Sinai. This is the majority of the Torah, starting at Exodus 19, going all the way to Numbers 10. So Exodus 19, they arrive at Sinai. Numbers 10, they leave Sinai. Leviticus is all in the middle there. So it's that's where and when this takes place, according to the text of the Bible, according to the narrative level of the Torah. But you all know us biblical scholars, we love our source criticism. So this is what we're going to talk about for the first little bit here. We don't think this was all written in one go on Sinai. We have no idea how far back some of these pieces go. Maybe they go back to Sinai, we don't know. But we can tell from the way that some of these texts are written that they reflect different times and places. And there's actually layers that we can find here within the book of Leviticus. But most of it is written by P, that priestly source. So this is thinking about the documentary hypothesis. This is, again, a hypothesis, a guess from biblical scholars. The vast majority of biblical scholars would say that there is a priestly text that underlies Leviticus, but also parts of Genesis, like Genesis 1, that underlies parts of Exodus, as well as parts of Numbers. So this is something that spans the parts of the Torah, except for Deuteronomy. There's no P in Deuteronomy. But we also think that P is actually contained mostly to Leviticus 1 through 16. So at chapter 17, things change. We'll get to that in a second. But generally speaking, there's a lot of debate about this, but most biblical scholars would say that this was written, the P texts of Leviticus were written sometime around the exile. The reason is that some of the language that's used, some of the references that are made seem to signal the exile as a place. Also, it would have made sense to write down a lot of these materials about what happens inside the temple once you've lost the temple, so that you can't train people in it, on the spot. That is to say, you have to try to remember in some way over a long period of time until you can rebuild the temple. So that's when we think a lot of these materials were written. In the Torah, starting in Genesis, God is called Elohim in the priestly materials, but then in Exodus 3 and 6, there's the revelation of the divine name according to the P source. The name Yahweh is revealed. And after that, you'll get characters in P starting to use the name Yahweh. This is a big kind of part of the priestly theology. It tends to think about God as being fairly remote, fairly transcendent. Think about Genesis 1, the God is creator, a lot of focus on order and structure and dividing things, making sort of patterns in things. The priests are really into that. Think of your friend who is OCD or something and, needs to separate things for order and structure. That's very much a picture of both the God of the P source, but also of some of the priests themselves. We'll get to why that is in a minute. But yeah, it's emphasis on divine glory, that God is powerful, God is special, God is different, God is holy, God is other. Those are all major important words for P. We imagine that there was a really old idea about how Israel was a worshiping community that was out there, but P tries to direct that in a way that points it towards the temple, or towards, in the narrative of the Torah, towards the tabernacle, that mobile temple. And it tries to focus people on things like diet regulations and the instructions to the priests and sacrifice. So this is it's in a way trying to redirect probably some of the folk religion that we might have seen in ancient Israel. We definitely see like a rigorous kind of style, which is actually nice for exegesis exams, because you can get to know some technical vocabulary and you can use it over and over again. But they tend to be orderly and formulaic. So genealogies, chronological markers, things like rituals, which we will read a ritual together today. And also the P source, this supports a particular group of priests. There were lots of groups of priests in ancient Israel, and the P source likes and supports the sons of Aaron, the Aaronites. In the P source, the Levites are not important. They are not only just not important, they can't serve at the temple. They are the assistants to the priests. It's only a very narrow group of Levites called the sons of Aaron, who have direct descendants from Aaron. They can serve at the temple. They can receive gifts from the temple. So they're the ones that are the true priests, the sons of Aaron, according to P. We'll see that's different in other parts of Leviticus. But for chapters 1 through 16, priest means a son of Aaron, a direct descendant of Aaron, and not of any other Levites. They were considered lowly help, assistants. Now, we have a very different author, a very different community. We don't know exactly who this is. We have a very different voice that begins to emerge in chapter 17. So chapter 17 of Leviticus, we get a shift towards what we call the holiness code. Why holiness code? Because it's a code, it's a legal code. We start with worship regulations, we end with blessings and curses. It sounds a lot like Deuteronomy. It sounds a lot like Deuteronomy, especially chapters 12 through 26. It's patterned like that. It has sort of a 10 commandments in there. It's got laws about all kinds of things like you find in Deuteronomy. It's also patterned a little bit like Exodus chapters 20 through 24, that covenant code. So it looks like a legal code that was made to function like a legal code. Whereas the first part of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 16, seem to have functioned more like a priestly manual. The second part, Leviticus 17 through 24, through 27, 17 through 26, really 27 is a question mark we'll get to later, but 17 through 26 really is more of an actual legal code that was meant for the people. This is meant for all the people. So we have less clear dating. This seems to be later than P. So sometime in the Persian period, post-exilic period, we don't really know. But they always say God is Yahweh, but also be holy. Holy is the most repeated word in this section. So that's why it's called the holiness code, but also they do something to holiness. They say that everyone in the community is holy, not just priests. Every space is holy or should be holy, not just the temple. People call this a democratization of holiness. It's a spreading of holiness to all the people and an assumption that all the people are going to share in this holiness. We also can see that it's organized like a law code. I say atarts here in the slide, but actually starts with a law of altars and ends with the blessings and curses. So it's patterned, like I said, like these covenant code and like the Deuteronomic code. It looks like a law code for the people. It also seems to be interested in Levites. They're mentioned in chapter 25. They're not mentioned. Levites are not mentioned. Chapters 1 through 16. Only the sons of Aaron are mentioned. Levites in Numbers are said to be like nothing, and they're assistants to the priests. They're not even mentioned really in the book of Leviticus, which is weird until you get to chapter 25, and then there seems to be this inclusion of Levites. So a lot of people would say, a lot of biblical scholars would say that the Levites might be behind this holiness code. The Levites seem to be people who don't serve at the main temple for the most part, at least don't do that all the time. They tend to wander around the people, and they try to talk to the people about their faith and about religious activity. So it seems to make sense that they would try to democratize holiness in some way. Great example of this is Leviticus 19, which says, be holy over and over and over again. So we'll get to those more in a minute, but these are the two main sources, the P source, the priestly source, chapters 1 through 16, and the H source, the holiness code source, Leviticus 17 through 26. Leviticus 27 is the last chapter of the book. A lot of people call that an appendix. It doesn't look like the rest of the book. It's strange. You're going back to P for some reason. It sounds more like priestly materials, but they will not. I don't want to promise they'll not choose Leviticus 27, but there's lots of better things to choose. So just to show you a little bit about these like different sources, if the Yahwist source, the J source, if that's red, the Elohist source is green. If you remember, the Yahweh source is like Judah, it's Jerusalem centered, it's from the royal court. The green source is from the north, because the people in those parts of the Pentateuch that are described by the E source tend to hang out in the north, but also they tend to like receive information kind of like a prophet does. They have dreams, they kind of see things, they know things. So people tend to think this might come from prophetic circles in the north. We've got the priestly source, which again is the sons of Aaron, and then redactor. Now, you'll often have people, maybe even on this exam, who just pretend H doesn't exist. So lots of people just say it's all P. So whoever writes the word may just pretend H doesn't exist. 99% of biblical scholars are going to say, yes, H is for sure real, definitely exists, is a big deal. It just depends on who writes the exam and who grades it, who writes the grading chart, the grading information. So if the test seems to presume in the way it's written that Leviticus 19 was written by P, you can argue against it. Also, you can just kind of go with the flow. I don't know what's going to be better in that case, but so this chart just presumes that like all the P stuff is, all holiness code is P. There's a little bit of redactional links in there, but I'll say you'll find information that says this both ways. I think, and I think the vast majority of biblical scholars think H is a real thing. It's important, and we need to think about it. So if you get a text that's Leviticus 17 to 26, say, for example, Leviticus 19, you get a section of that text, it's worthwhile thinking about H. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit on the symbolic world of the priestly source. So what did they think was important about rituals, about the religious rituals of ancient Israel? So one thing to say here is that the Leviticus is weird, it's strange, it's unusual, people make fun of it. I get all that, but also, our rituals look pretty weird to people who aren't part of our community too. So if we keep that in mind and think, okay, so what do the rituals mean to them? That's what I'll talk about for the next little bit, try to get us into this world. What do they think these things mean? I am going to be using as my guide to this world, and I suggest that you use as your guide to this world, Jacob Milgrom. Jacob Milgrom was a rabbi, biblical scholar. He died several years ago, but he wrote three massive commentaries on Leviticus. He also wrote a double volume commentary for a different series. These are the Anchor Bible series. These are excellent. They're really good. You need to probably engage these in some way at some point. Leviticus 1 through 16, obviously it has like a huge introduction to it, but also each individual chapter, if they assign you Leviticus 17, I would look at the Leviticus 17 commentary. I'd also skim over and see if in the introduction, Leviticus 1 through 16 is going to have the introduction. If he has anything about Leviticus 17 in there, they'll have a little index in the back that'll tell you where these texts are to be found. So this is Jacob Milgrom's way of thinking about ancient priests and their symbolic world. I mean, this is the normal way of talking about this in biblical studies as well. That's just where this comes from. So what we want to say, what we think about is that ancient priests centered their symbolic world on the problem of holiness. There's a story in Leviticus 10 of the sons of Aaron, like the actual biological sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, his oldest sons. They start to mess around with the fire on the altar and then they blow up. Something happens with the Ark of the Covenant where someone touches it, right? And then like he just dies. So there are these stories of miraculous deaths that occur when people mess around with holy things, sanctified objects, holy objects. The issue in these stories is not that God's mean or God's bad or God's nasty. The issue is that God is unbelievably powerful. And so messing around with unbelievable power is a bad idea. In the same way that if you mess around with a nuclear power plant and just start pushing random buttons, it's a bad idea. The nuclear power plant doesn't hate you when it explodes, it just does it because that's what happens. So if we imagine that the priests, they see their world as really this place of intersection, a thin place of intersection between an unbelievably powerful, holy energy force that is God and a world that is mortal and fallible and weak. That everything in our world would just fall apart and be incinerated by the power of God, not because God wants to, but just because that's what happens when unbelievable power enters into a space that can't contain it. A nuclear explosion happens, right? So the priests are trying to function like the workers at a nuclear power plant. They are there for your safety. They're there because everyone wants God to be present with them, because God's presence is power, it's energy, it's beauty, it's wonder. It fuels the community. It helps, it protects you, it saves you in so many ways. Communion with God is their number one idea. But God is also not us. God is holy and powerful and different and other and is pure energy. So there needs to be some mediation. So they need that. Yeah, Leviticus is the nuclear power plant safety manual. Here's how we conduct ourselves so that we can have this power in our midst and be respectful and responsible and help us all be safe. That's how they think about themselves. So in this symbolic world, we've got holiness. I've just talked a little bit about that, but holiness is a really important topic. We're gonna have to get into it a bit, but then also purity. Purity and holiness are two related concepts, but not the same. So we're gonna have to keep them separate in our minds, because all of Leviticus, all the symbolic world hangs on us making sure that we tell the difference between purity and holiness and know what they're doing. And then we'll talk about the holy space of the temple, and then we'll talk about the special action that priests can do, and that's sacrifice. So that's our plan. So first we'll start with holiness. So holiness just means otherness, just means it's different. What it means in religious terms is that it has to do with God. So the priestly text means that holy means it's of God or like God. It gives you access in some way to the divine realm, which is ultimate power, pure power. So holiness is worrisome, but also necessary for us to live as a community. The opposite of holiness is not unholiness, in the sense that usually unholy means bad or evil or wrong or morally bad, depraved, have something to do with Satan. None of that is in the priestly mindset. To them, the opposite of, they don't talk about Satan, the devil. There's no talk about that in Leviticus. There's the one mention of Azazel in the Day of Atonement ceremony, which we'll get to. But they don't think about it. They don't spend time on it. They don't tell you to avoid Azazel or anything. It's not important in their theology. Their theology revolves around us, around people, and our relationship to God. That's it. And at the center of that is holiness, which is being like God. But then the opposite of that is commonness. Commonness. So the common just means not set aside for God's special use, not holy. So there's holy days, and then there's regular days and common days. And the common days are not bad, and the holy days aren't better necessarily. They're just days where you're supposed to do something special that's set apart for God's special use. Or holy spaces, the temple, it's just a place. There's nothing magical about it. There's holy building, the temple. Again, nothing magical about it. The word for temple is the same word as the word for palace, like a king's palace. It's just a big house for God. But it needs to be treated in a special way because it's holy. So it's not that it's perfect, it's beautiful, it's morally good, it has nothing to do with that. It's just, it has been ritually set aside for God's special use. So it needs to be treated in special ways. This is true of people too, priests. Priests are ordained not because they're good, not because they're smart, not because they're nice people or they're good at pastoral care. They're ordained in the ancient world because they were born into a certain family and they got to be a certain age. It has nothing to do with how good they are. But they're supposed to take this seriously. If they don't, they could blow up like Adab and Nabi do. Yeah. There's consequences, but the consequences aren't for if you're mean to your kids or something. I mean, it just literally has to do with follow these rules. So common things just mean not holy. So common space, common days, common people. We're not bad. It's just normal. There's normal and then there's holy. If something is holy, then you need to treat it special. And that brings us to purity and impurity, sometimes called cleanness and uncleanness. Purity and impurity is a better way to put it because it has nothing to do with being unclean in the sense of bad or dirty or unhygienic. It has nothing to do with hygiene. The most pure space you can get is the temple floor that's full of guts and blood. So not about cleanliness, not about hygiene. It's a ritual state, ritual purity and ritual impurity. They follow very specific laws and rules, and you can find these in Leviticus chapters 11 through 15. And they explain some of the ritual purity and impurity system, what things make things pure or impure. So you might get questions about this, and they might relate in some way to the New Testament, how Jesus treated people who were unclean, right? The lepers weren't sinners. They're only unclean because they have a very specific skin disease. If you have COVID, you're not impure, has nothing to do with like your health. And it's a very small set of very specific skin conditions that make your skin turn white and flaky. If you have bruises on your skin, if you have a cut, not a problem. You can go in the temple. If you have basically what we think was eczema, then like I have a little bit of eczema on my finger, so I couldn't go in the temple. I have to like get this taken care of before I go in the temple. The other things are blood. So if I'm bleeding, that might be okay. I mentioned bleeding might be okay, but there's certain kinds of blood, especially if I touch a lot of blood, I can't go into the temple with it. If a woman gives birth, there's going to be blood and also fluids of different kinds that come from the body. Those are going to make someone impure. If men have an emission of some kind, sexual emission, then they're going to be impure. So a lot of people have said, okay, they're weird about sex, they're weird about women. They don't like menstruation. They don't like birth. Like that's probably what they're focused on. Some people have talked about that. Jacob Milgram was really good for going very carefully through all this evidence and comparing it with other ancient Near Eastern sources and saying basically what we see here are shared concerns about life. So the skin condition, why would it be the skin condition that's flaky? They translate it as leprosy, but really it's eczema probably, or other kinds of skin conditions, probably tons of different skin conditions, but ones that get flaky and your skin, because it looks like you're dead. It's like that's what happens to dead bodies, right? The skin dries up and flakes off. So if you look like you're dying, or if you encounter blood, which is the power of life, and so is very special and powerful, or if a woman gives birth, which means that she has generated life, or if a man has an emission, which means that he has in some way like maybe done something that could have contributed to the production of life. For them, those things are super powerful ritual acts. And those super powerful ritual acts are powerful because they do something that God can do, which is make life or take life. So the power of making life and taking life, that is what leads to impurity, ritual impurity, which is weird. Why would those things lead to ritual impurity? Ritual impurity is not actually about dirtiness or uncleanliness or being bad. It's about a short circuit of power. So if humans do things that God does, or if humans kind of step into the realm of things that are ultimately of God's concern, we might think that we have the power over life, the power over death. We might think that the production of a new child, new life from a woman's body is so amazing that like we did this. There's like this humility. It's really a humility that if we come into the forces of death or life, we need to wait a bit. These are all manageable. So this right here is a mikvah, a ceremonial bath. It doesn't have any water in it right now, but it had water in the ancient world, and people would walk down here and get, kind of bathe and then come back up. The water's probably dirty. It doesn't rain much there, and they had the same baths all the time, but it was ritually pure. So this is one way to cleanse. Water actually can cleanse you. Also, time can cleanse you. And sometimes there's other ritual acts that can cleanse you, some certain prayers and things. Again, Leviticus 11 through 15 can tell you about these different forms of purity and impurity and how to manage them ritually. But again, nothing to do with being bad, nothing to do with being sinful, nothing that like you deserved it. You have to do these things sometimes. You have to bury your loved ones. It's a good thing to do. You have to do it. It means you have to touch a dead body. That means you have to stay away from the temple for a little bit. If you're a priest, that's like a big deal. You have to stay away from the temple and you have to really watch out because you're a holy person. So when you're a holy person and you get impure, you got to you're kind of, tripping the wires there, right? You might start an explosion. So you got to be very, very careful if you're a priest. And you especially don't want to bring that stuff into the temple, the most holy of places. So this is our idea of ritual purity and purity. It's another thing to say is it's contagious. So you can spread it by touch. So I touch blood and I touch you and you bring that into the temple, then that can make you impure. Or if somebody gives birth and then touches another person, that person goes in the temple, it's possible that that could bring in some sort of ritual impurity, and it could have negative consequences. So these are things like priests especially have to watch out for. The average person would not care unless you're going to the temple. So if I'm an unholy person or a common person, I'm unclean all the time or impure all the time because I don't need to go to the temple all the time. When I need to go to the temple, I need to watch myself for a couple of days, wash myself, maybe pray a certain prayer, and then I can go, right? So I just need to be careful when I go into the temple. So not about morality. It's about touch and contagious touch. It can spread, and it's about powers of life and death. So that's ritual. Now, there is another category. Unfortunately, in Hebrew, they use the same word for this, which is chatat, which means sin. It's like impurity / sin. The impurity parts, the ritual impurity, they use the same word to mean when I do something really, really bad. Why do they do this? They could tell the difference in their mind. We know because they use these words in ways that are very carefully managed, but it makes it really hard for us, unfortunately. But nonetheless, there's a second category that for us, we need to keep straight, and that's moral purity and impurity. Now, moral purity and impurity has to do when I do bad stuff, and it doesn't make it so that I can't go into the temple. I can go to the temple because if I kill someone, I can run to the temple and take sanctuary. It's not a bad thing. If I kill someone, I can't like spread it by contagion. If I'm a bad person and I do a bad act, I'm not going to hurt you by touching you. But if I touch an impure dead body and then I touch you, then I'm spreading that ritual contagion. So that is to say, ritual purity and impurity is contagious. Moral impurity is not. You have to do it to get it. And it sticks with you. None of the rituals in Leviticus I'll say this, it is not clear that any of the rituals in Leviticus can help you with your moral impurity. If you kill someone, especially intentionally, if you intentionally kill someone, there is nothing in Leviticus that helps you. This might be why the prophets say all the time, what are you doing sacrificing? It's not going to help you. It's not that sacrifices don't help. The prophets are saying you have killed people and you're trying to pay for it by sacrifice. It doesn't work like that. Sacrifice is about other things, not about making up for your sin. We'll get into this in more detail later, but just to say, big idea. Sorry, you can't kill your way out of sin. The Old Testament never says this, and I believe the New Testament never says it either. So we'll get to that more later, but just putting that out there, okay? So the rituals in Leviticus don't atone for you. This stuff can hurt the sanctuary. It can hurt the sanctuary. It can also hurt you, but it can hurt the sanctuary as well. It can kind of fly to the sanctuary and kind of attach to the altar. The moral impurity can attach to kind of fly to the, and it starts to make the temple dirty. And after a while, God gets upset. God doesn't like living in a dirty house. So God starts to get mad about this. So this is the way they think about moral impurity. It kind of attaches to you, but also kind of goes and attaches to the temple. Sometimes atoning for sin, like kind of doing some rituals in the temple, can take care of the temple, but it can't necessarily take care of you. Okay, so those are impurity and purity, and two kinds: moral impurity and ritual impurity. Leviticus is almost all concerned with ritual purity and impurity. But then also, we'll get to the moral stuff later. Okay, so if we think about these as kind of like two different pairs of things, pure and impure, and here I'm talking about ritual purity and impurity, and then holy and common. They're like parallel, right? So if I am someone who is holy and I'm totally ritually pure, I'm cool. Everything's good. I can go in the temple. I can do my job. If I'm a priest, I'm a holy person. Or if there's an object that's holy, like the menorah goes into the temple, it's got to be holy and pure. It can't touch a dead body and then go in the temple. So then it's cool. We're all cool. If you're common, but you're impure, I put a yellow there because it's like you can't go into the temple, but you probably don't need to. So just a little caution. You just got to have a little caution, but you're probably fine. If you're a common person, a regular person, or a common object, shovels don't need to be holy unless you take them into temple grounds to build something in the temple. Then they have to be pure. Okay, so if I am pure and common, then cool. I mean, I still have to have the yellow there because I can't like go into the Holy of Holies. I can't like, there are certain places I can't go just so I can't go there. But I'm probably pretty cool to like go into the temple if I'm a common person or a common thing and I'm pure, ritually pure, I'm okay to go in there. But here's the big problem. Here's the short circuit. Here's the explosion. If it's a holy thing and it comes into contact with impure stuff, even if it's outside the temple, it's a bad thing. But especially if you bring a holy person, object into the temple and it's impure ritually, you're asking for an explosion. That's the nuclear power plant. That's Chernobyl. You know, like, I mean, the sirens are going off, you know, the meters are all going nuts. Everything's about to fall apart. So that's the problem. Okay, so this holy space at the temple then really is important, not because the bricks or the stones are important or because the columns are important or the artwork's important. All those things are nice, but they look just like a palace. It's important because it was set aside, ritually dedicated for Yahweh's space. So now it has to be handled in a certain way. And it has this basin out front, big basin of water to wash things in. It's got a giant stand you can see over here, this giant stand in the corner, that's the altar in the courtyard. So people could come into the courtyard, but then inside the temple, you had to be a priest to go in there. It's more holy in there. And then the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could go in there one day of the year for the atonement, the Day of Atonement. It's in Leviticus 16. So there's like kind of more progressively holy spaces, and you got to know where you can go and where you can't go. And there's different altars. The altar outside, the altar inside, the altar in the Holy of Holies. They do different things. There's altars for incense where you only burn good smelling stuff. There's altars where you cook food, cook animals, and so on. So there's different kind of objects for different things. We can get to that later, but here's just another view of the inside of the temple, and a priest is allowed inside there, like you can see. And then in the Holy of Holies, which just means the most set apart place, like the most private place you can get in the temple, that's the Holy of Holies. And that's kind of like God's bedroom. In Leviticus, on the level of the narrative in Leviticus, they keep talking about the tabernacle, because in the they haven't yet got to the Holy Land. They haven't yet, taken Jerusalem yet. They haven't yet built the temple. All that happens only after Solomon. So in the level of the story, Moses and Aaron and all those folks just keep talking about the tabernacle, the mobile tent that kind of takes the place of the temple for a time. So it's modeled exactly like the temple. There's like an outer courtyard, there's like an inner courtyard, there's different altars and stuff. So it's like a little tiny mobile version of the temple, according to P. According to J, this thing's totally different. It's a tent of meeting. It's like a democratic place where everyone gets together and has conversations about the future, but you don't need to worry about that. In P, this is what the tabernacle is. And this is from Milgram's commentary, and you can see like what Milgram argues, which is really sophisticated arguing, and I think he's right. Some people argue about this, but the different altars in the temple and in the tabernacle actually correspond to different kinds of sins. So the altars have horns on them, the four horned altars. This is a normal thing in the ancient world. Everyone's got four horned altars in that part of the world. But in Israel, they talk about them as like being almost like lightning rods for bad stuff, for ritual impurity, but also for moral impurity. They're like lightning rods for both kinds of impurities, and they attract it so that you can try to do something about it. So the altar in the courtyard, the outside altar, that attracts involuntary individual sins. So people who mess up, when I say involuntary, there's an argument about what that word means. It happens a lot in Leviticus. What about voluntary sins? Sorry, they don't talk about those. If you do stuff and you really mean to do it, I don't know, like they don't have a lot for you. But if you mess up and someone brings it to your attention, Leviticus keeps saying, and then if you knowingly choose to like touch blood and walk into the temple because you want to like see what happens, sorry, can't help you. But if you accidentally do something that's impure and then come into the temple, like you don't wait enough days, and you're like, I counted the days wrong. Oh my goodness, I didn't mean to bring impurity into the temple, like ritual impurity, but I accidentally did. Then you can atone for that. It's going to put some dirt in God's temple, and that dirt is going to attach to the horn of the altar, and there's something you can do to take care of your mess. So an involuntary individual sin, I bury a dead body, I bury a loved one, and I wait a lot of days, but not quite enough days before I become ritually pure, before I can go back into the temple. And I do go back in the temple, and I realize that I've done this. Oh no, I can't see anything. Nothing explodes in front of my face, but I know that there's this spot on the altar that I put there. And I know that if other people keep leaving spots there, God's going to go. God's going to leave. This is going to break our relationship. So I need to go take care of that. So I go and do a sacrifice. And we'll talk about sacrifices in a minute, but those help. The sacrifices do not pay for your sins. They help clean up the altar. They help clean up and restore the relationship with God. But if you mean to do something bad, you got bigger problems. So then there's involuntary communal sins, and those can be taken care of at the altar that's inside the temple, inside the sanctuary, the main room, like God's living room. And there's an incense altar there. That's where you take care of communal sins. Like everyone does something impure together. Like you decide to do something that's not right. There's like a way for you to handle that. A bunch of priests get together and have a cookout, and they don't cook it. They don't cook the meat at the temple. They cook it surreptitiously in their backyard. And you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to bring all of the meat that you eat to Jerusalem and cook it at the temple. So like they're like, sneaking good steaks at their house for themselves. That's bad. It's communal. Let's say it's involuntary. That is to say, like, oh, we didn't know the rules yet. We're young priests. Like we just didn't know. You can take care of it at the incense altar inside. Then there's the altar at the ark, the mercy seat, which really just means the covering on top of the Ark of the Covenant. That functions as an altar, and there you can take care of brazen and unrepented offenses. How many days a year? One. So one day a year, you can take care of all the real junk, all the stuff that we, and that's the Day of Atonement. So we'll get to that later. So this is the holy space. Yeah.
So brazen and unrepented offenses
Yeah.
are not voluntary.
This is a question.
Okay.
It seems the way it's an argument. Like Leviticus 16, does it cover unrepentant offenses, or does it cover like involuntary offenses? Whatever, does it cover voluntary? We don't really know. But Milgram's reconstruction, his argument about Leviticus 16 is that it takes care of everything. And it doesn't really, it sort of says that. It just says the sin. So it's unclear. Leviticus 16 might be the catch-all. There are people who say, sorry, I don't think it's the catch-all. I think basically if you commit voluntary sins, you're out of luck. I tend to think that Milgram's probably right in the worldview of ancient Israel. They probably thought that you could take care of these really bad sins one day a year, and you could like the priest kind of took care of that by sacrificing and by being at the altar inside the Holy of Holies that one day a year. I think that probably worked. In the same sense, it's not clear. It's not written in a clear way in Leviticus 16. Yeah.
That one day here is because it's Yom Kippur.
That is Yom Kippur. Yeah, the Day of Atonement. Yeah, and Kippur really meaning covering, and so it's that place, the covering, the day that the priest goes into the cover of the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. So that seems to be the catch-all, but it's an argument. It's an argument, and they might ask you about that if they ask about the Day of Atonement. But we'll take a look at that in a second. Okay, so sacrifice in general. What is sacrifice? I'll tell you a couple of things about this. We're going to come back to this too at the end, but sacrifice is a barbecue on the outside altar where literally if you bring an animal and you kill it, then you butcher it. The priest handles the blood because the people aren't supposed to handle the blood. The priest handles the blood because the blood is holy, it's sacred, it's got life in it. And then you cook it. You put it on top. The altar has a grate, has coals. It's literally a barbecue. And then you're supposed to eat it with the priests. The people eat it. In the ancient world, lots of other cultures, Egyptians, Babylonians, Canaanites, they said that the gods ate the food. That's why he brought it. Leviticus is really clear. God likes the smell. God loves barbecue smells, but God doesn't need to eat anything because God's not like us. So God doesn't need food. The priests do need the food. They actually come out and say it. Like the priests, if you want priests to be here, you gotta feed them. You gotta feed their families. Like they need food. But also, it's for you. You partake in this. And then also it's for the people that you've messed over. If you've messed over people somehow, like you can actually invite them here and you all eat together. I'll show you that verse in just a little bit. So I'll say that sacrifice really is this kind of meal, it seems, at least in certain ways. There are other altars besides that big altar outside where you cook animals. There's the incense altar inside, which is nothing dies for that. Nothing dies for the incense altar. And then there's an altar where there's like grain and bread, cereal, and the priests eat that too. So it's good smells, good bread, good meat. But God doesn't need any of it necessarily. God kind of likes it. It's nice. But also notice that sacrifice does not require death. So the offerings, the offerings of incense and the offerings of bread do not require death. Yeah. Sacrifice is not fundamentally about death. It's not fundamentally about life, or it's not fundamentally about atonement in the sense that like substitution. It's not about substitutionary atonement. So that is to say that the animal is not substituting for you. It's not dying because you should have died. The animal is there to be eaten because you need to eat, but also it's there because of its blood. The blood has a special function we'll get to in a minute. So the death doesn't have to happen. In the same way that the incense altar doesn't revolve around death, the bread doesn't revolve around death. So this is just a special thing that blood can do. And then it's also food for sustenance. So this is sacrifice. Okay. These four-horned altars. Here's an actual four-horned altar from Beersheba, which is in the south. This was found like rebuilt into a wall, and then archaeologists put it back together. So at some point they undid these local sanctuaries like Josiah or Hezekiah, whatever these reformations within the history of Israel, where they centralized worship around Jerusalem. That didn't used to be the case, as this altar from this Israelite altar from Beersheba, Judahite altar from Beersheba shows us. But they had these horns, the four horns. They're just four spikes, and again, those were like these kind of things that caught like what you might call lightning rods, right? They attract sin, kind of like lightning rods attract lightning. But also, those are the places then, if they're dirty with sin or impurity, you could take the blood from the animal, and the priest, not you, because the priest is special, the priest can handle the power of the blood, could rub it on the horns of the altar and so clean it. So here we get ritual detergent. There's other things that function as ritual detergent too, like the ashes of the red heifer, which is a ritual that's described in Leviticus. So here we get like a red cow that could be burned, and the ashes of it could also function as a ritual detergent, but usually it was blood, the blood of animals. That's what so you've got Lysol down here. It cleans away impurities. That's what it does. Not because the thing died, not because it died for you, not because it died on your behalf. Literally, it's just blood itself has this power in it. It doesn't have to do with death per se. Now, why do they sacrifice? Sacrifice is not about atonement in the sense of paying for your sins. It's not about undoing your sins necessarily. It's not about death. It's about communion. It's about relationship, according to Leviticus. So Leviticus, there's a part of it where there's two different versifications. So Leviticus, sometimes some books of the Old Testament, there's a Jewish versification in Hebrew, and then there's a Christian, Latin, now English versification. That is to say, sometimes you see this in the Psalms too. The Hebrew Psalms are like one verse off. The Ten Commandments in Exodus are like this. They're off in the Hebrew and in the English, precisely because Christians do the Ten Commandments differently than Jews do. They break them in different parts. So here in Leviticus 6:5-6 in the English, which is in the BHS, that's the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the Hebrew version, and the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, which follows that versification. They say that's Leviticus 5:24-25. So same verses. They're just broken, that chapter is broken in different ways between Christian and Jewish traditions. The translation in the NRSV is terrible, I'm sorry, but you can go to Milgram's commentary or really any recent commentary and read a much better translation. Here's my own translation, but the person who has offended, according to this verse in Leviticus, the person who is offended shall make the victim entirely whole. So if you mess someone over, again, this is part of this larger unintentional thing. So if you somehow accidentally steal money from someone, then make them entirely whole, add a fifth more in addition, and give it to the victim at the time of the reparation offering. So this is one kind of offering that could perhaps help you with moral iniquity. This is, I will get to where it is. There's just one little bit here that's like, if you do bad stuff to someone, this is what you do. So let's say you steal money from someone. Then you make them entirely whole, add some more in addition, make sure that they get more than like you stole, right? And then you invite them there to the actual ritual in the temple. You give it to them, whatever makes them whole, at the time of the offering. So the animal's cooking, barbecue's about to go on. The person who offended must bring to Yahweh a reparation offering of a ram without blemish from the flock, valued by you. So you got to say, this is a good one here. And you're supposed to try to make up for it something to be the reparation offering. So then you show up with your ram, the priests are there, and the people that you've harmed. You're giving them the money or whatever you've taken from them at the time of the reparation offering, some grain or something. And then you all sit down at a meal together. So then you break bread with the person that you've either who has hurt you or who you have hurt, and the priest. Maybe their families are there too. That is to say, it becomes a reconciliation meal, really. And the idea is that it's not just y'all who are there, it's God too. So this is this reparation, this communion building that is meant to undo harm that's been done. So it's not about killing animals to try to get out of hell. Just make sure we all are on the same page about that. Okay, so some of these other rituals that we find in Leviticus, and I'll get to a chart of them in just a minute, but some of these other rituals we find, by the way, I'm going to 5:30. That's I hope that's okay. And that was the time. Okay, great. 5:30. So ritual types, there are these sacrifices we'll get to in a minute, but these ritual types, right? Foundational rituals. There are a bunch of rituals that you'll find to start things, especially ordination. Leviticus 8 through 10 is our ordination manual. It also includes stories or narratives. It's the only narrative part of Leviticus. This is where the story of Nadab and Abihu shows up. Aaron's kids who don't take anything seriously and then blow up in the temple. But the rites of ordination, how you found a new ordainment, how you inaugurate a priesthood, how you start stuff. And we imagine they would have had rituals for how you start a place of worship, right? How you found a new temple. They have these described in First Kings and so on. But so we have some of these rituals that are about starting stuff. We also have life cycle rituals, rituals about birth, rituals about death, rituals about menstruation, rituals about other kind of parts of life. So that is to say, we have these rituals that bring people into the community and bring them into new stages of life, and then usher them into God's presence at death. So these rituals can be found. Leviticus 12 has a bunch of these. You'll see that Leviticus 11 has a bunch about clean and unclean foods, or pure and impure foods, pure and impure animals. And then chapter 12, we've got some rituals about birth that have to do with childbirth. So chapter 13 is about leprosy, about unclean skin conditions, and things like that. So you can see these are kind of organized in a way that we might not do that. We might find a better organization system for all this, but we can find some life cycle rituals there. Notice that marriage is not important. There's no marriage ritual. Nobody in the Bible gets married and there's like a big ceremony. It's just, you do it privately. It's not a contract. So not all of our big rituals map onto theirs. Conjugal rituals. So there's like rituals based on the calendar. The big list of these is in Numbers 28 to 29. There's like the big list of rituals that have to do with like what day is this or what day is that. There's the Day of Atonement, obviously, in Leviticus 16. But at the end of Leviticus, you'll find some kind of charts, basically in word form, some kind of charts about like when to do things. But really, there's a little bit about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee in chapter 25. There's a little bit of timing of different rituals you can have. But ultimately, the most clear statement of this is in priestly material, but it's not in the book of Leviticus. So you might need to reference it. You could reference Numbers 28 to 29 if someone asks about Sukkot. When's Sukkot, or when's another festival or something? You might say, that's not Leviticus, that's not, but it's part of the P material. So it could be fair game for them to ask about something like that. And then we have contingent rituals. Contingent rituals are ones that happen when something particular happens, like you mess up. So these are the ones that we all read about. And this is what Leviticus is mainly about, these contingent rituals, especially the beginning of Leviticus, the priestly stuff. So the contingent rituals. Let's take a look at one of these contingent rituals. If you follow with me, if you're reading it here at home, Leviticus 4 is where I'm going to look. Leviticus 4 is a particular kind of offering. And if you just start at Leviticus 1, you'll see Leviticus 1 is about the burnt offering. Then chapter 2, the editors have put a little in italics, at least for the NRSV, a little title that says grain offerings. And then Leviticus 3 says offerings of well-being. And then Leviticus 4 says sin offerings. That word is chatat. Jacob Milgram talks about this a lot. That word should there be understood as really purification. It's really more about purification than it is about sin. Sin sounds a lot like we're Augustine. We're like wrestling with our like inner, morality. It's not the question that's happening here. This is like if you touch blood and walk into the temple and you don't know. It's really about purification. How do you purify sin? Sin meaning just a mistake you made. But it had very little to do with like moral iniquity. Then chapters 5 and 6. This is where we get like a problem with the division between the chapters. The Hebrew and the English go off track a little bit at the end of chapter 5, beginning of chapter 6. But this is where we start to get some stuff about like when you make bad choices in life, or when you hurt people, when you steal things. So chapter 6 in the English, whenever you sin, commit a trespass against the Lord by deceiving a neighbor, notice that it's God who you're really sinning against. The temple is the place that really deals with the impact of this, when the sin kind of flies and attaches itself to the horns of the altar. When you deceive a neighbor in a matter of deposit, now you still have to make the neighbor right, whole. So there's a recognition that this hurts the people, but ultimately it's God who someone has. The priests are interested in how to fix the relationship with God first, and most importantly, because God's a nuclear reactor. That's the basic idea. Okay, so but about the actual particular ritual. So let's go back to 4. And if we go to 4, just look at the very beginning of 4. The Lord spoke to Moses, just in chapter 4, verse 1 in the NRSV. Speak to the people of Israel, saying, when anyone sins unintentionally, again, what about intentional? They don't say. When anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things that are not to be done, and here they really mean ritual stuff. If anyone does any of them, bring blood in the temple or whatever, it is, if it is the anointed priest who sins. So if it's an anointed priest, a holy priest who sins, that's a big deal. You got to do all this stuff. Now, if you slip down to verse 13, if the whole congregation of Israel errs, notice that's like the next, like, so priests are real bad. If the whole congregation does something bad, everyone steps in blood, walks into the temple, they don't realize it, big problem. You got to do big stuff to take care of this because a lot of people have done a bad thing. Now, verse 22, when the ruler sins, so not a priest, not the whole congregation, but still the most important person, most powerful person in the community, they have to offer something bigger to undo their mess. Then verse 27, if any of the ordinary people, that's me, I'm an ordinary person. So if I happen to sin unintentionally or bring impurity unintentionally by doing any of the things that I should not do, and I incur guilt meaning I've done the thing that I shouldn't do. If I have touched the body, walking in the temple, problem, when that sin has been made known to you. So when someone says, hey, the priest says, you're not supposed to do that. You go, oh no, what are you supposed to do then? Then you shall offer a female goat without blemish. So you're supposed to not like find the sick ones, the old ones that aren't worth much. You're supposed to bring a really good offering. The priest don't want to eat your leftovers. So bring a good thing, the best one you can find in your flock. Why a female, not a male? Because there would only have been a few male goats. They would have eaten the male goats young. They only keep one. Then they keep lots of female goats for also people would have lots more female goats around. So this is a much less onerous requirement for a typical person, an ordinary person. So the priest, verse 29, that's you, that's a person, whoever brings the sin or the problem, the impurity into the temple, then you shall lay your hand on the head of the chatat, the impurity offering or sin offering. But that means you're putting your hand on. Now, people have read this to mean like it's atoning for me, it's substituting for me, like this is taking the place of my life. I'm supposed to die for this. I'm at chapter 4, verse 29. You shall lay your hand on the head of the offering. This is not about that. It's a big, complicated space, the temple. Lots of people offering sacrifices, thousands of people there every day. Everyone, like you're like telling God, like, and the priest, like, this is for me, my mess up, like this, like make sure this cleans up my sin, right? So it's getting credit for what you're doing. But it's also just to make it clear who brought this goat, right? Me. So then the priest shall take some of its blood. So it's slaughtered. Whether the person slaughters it or the priest is unclear according to the text. I think probably the person slaughters it, and then the priest takes the blood and puts it on the horn of the altar and washes away the impurity that was brought by the person. And then the priest removes the fat. These are the parts that are kind of inedible, we imagine, and then burns it at the offering and offers that up to God. So God eats the inedible parts, and they turn up into smoke, and God's like, it smells great. I love when the gristle cooks, right? And then, thus, it makes a pleasing odor for God. God doesn't eat the food. You eat the food. The priest eats the food. Thus, the priest shall make atonement on your behalf, and then you shall be forgiven. That word is kippur. It'll be covered up. So it's not actually a word that means forgiven, unless we make it in Christian translation mean forgiven, which it really means covering. So it covers over, it cleans. It's like if you make a big stain on the carpet and like you cover it up so it looks nice. That's what you're doing to your sin with the blood. It's cleaning or covering it up. It's not necessarily it's not a question really of forgiveness at this point. Forgiveness will be what happens if you like steal from someone, then like you're asking them for forgiveness, but it's not exactly what happens in the sacrifice. The sacrifice doesn't forgive. The sacrifice cleans up the mess. The forgiveness is like, an internal choice that made by the person that you've offended. Yeah. So all to say, okay. So that's one ritual. I'm guessing, I don't know. I'm guessing that if they choose a ritual, they'll choose like one ritual like that. What you want to do is you want to look at the chapter as a whole. You want to say chapter 4 is about purification offerings. You want to read Milgram, what Milgram has to say about these purification offerings. Or chapter 3, offerings of well-being, the well-being offerings. Everything's great in your life. Things are cool. I'm going to offer well-being offering. What can you offer for a well-being offering? We'll see that later. But I'll just say, like, you want the big category, and then you'll want to look at the specific ritual they picked for you to look at, because it's not going to be the same. Like the priest, the ordained priest, has to do something different than the ordinary person does. We read the ordinary person ritual. They may give you 2 or 3 rituals, but being clear about these are directions for a ritual, it's a rubric. So we're reading like what the pastor has up front for the baptism, right? We're reading like the play, like rubric. But the people out there are just watching what's happening. So if you're the sinner, the impure person, you bring something to clean up your mess. You wouldn't necessarily know this. The priest might tell you what to do, but this is really for the priest. The priest would say, "You shall lay your." The priest is telling you, reading this to you, and telling you, or memorize it, and is giving you the instructions of what to do. Okay, so who are these priests? You have questions? Yeah, questions.
So it's a little bit like liturgy.
Yes, this is definitely liturgy. It's not the public-facing liturgy. It's the private liturgy for the priest to read. Yeah, exactly. It's your notes. Yeah. Okay, so priests. Who are these priests? They're the holy people. They're the set-apart people. That doesn't mean they're good. That doesn't mean that they're smart, but they should be. But nonetheless, it just means that they're in the right family at the right time. So what are they supposed to do? Supposed to give oracles. Supposed to tell you. They have dice on their breastplate, the Urim and the Thummim, and they roll the dice and they tell you things like, should we go to battle? David asked the priest. The priest says yes. What happened was the priest rolled the dice and the dice said yes. So the priest is supposed to tell you some things about what's going to happen. The priests are also supposed to teach you. They're told to teach you about impure things. So if you need to come into the temple, the priests are supposed to know Leviticus really well, and they're supposed to tell you, no, you shouldn't come into the temple. What'd you do today? What'd you do yesterday? Right? They're supposed to be able to help you understand these rules. They're complicated, but they can help you. Also, they're supposed to make decisions. Priests sometimes have to get together and decide big things like, what are we going to do as a people to atone for this thing that's like not covered in Leviticus, right? They have to actually like make choices about what they're going to do in their religious life together. Or are we going to renovate the temple now? They have to make big decisions like that. They have to give blessings. That blessing I started class with, they're supposed to give that all the time. They're supposed to actually say that prayer. We know that from these amulets. They had the amulet, like these priests had literal amulets with that prayer on it, and they're supposed to say it. They're supposed to give it to you if you asked for it. So it's supposed to give you blessings. And temple administration. They were supposed to take care of buildings and grounds. Supposed to take care of paying the people who brought things for them. And, they did hiring and firing. They did payroll. They did budget. So they were the temple administration. There's stories about this in the book of Kings, about them doing actual administrative work. So giving oracles or telling people like kind of what's going on, teaching them about things, helping them make decisions, giving them blessings, administering the temple, serving at the altar. Sounds a little bit like what pastors do today. And that's because pastors are based, obviously, on ancient world priests. So where do I find these? A lot of those instructions are in Leviticus 8 through 10, all about ordination, what priests are supposed to do, but also they're found sometimes in Numbers. Numbers has a lot of stuff in it about what priests can do and how they're supposed to do it. And then Ezekiel has a little bit about telling us about what priests are supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it in exile. But he tells people that priests are supposed to teach. And so the instructions are found mostly in Leviticus and Numbers, and a little bit we can get from Ezekiel, who told us a bit about what the job of a priest is. Okay, so what kind of priest do we have? Every priest is a Levite, right? Yes, but also every priest who serves at the altar, it was more than a Levite, at least at the Jerusalem altar. One thing to know is that the religious life of ancient Israel was super complicated, and that Leviticus was only one part of it. We know because the prophets tell us, the stories tell us that people sacrificed all over the place. They had all kinds of altars. They sometimes worshiped different gods. They had all kinds of priests that were not from the Levite family, not from the family of Aaron, and they were doing all kinds of religious stuff everywhere. Sometimes some stories lift them up as being good people. Sometimes they're said that they're being heretical. Seems to change time and place, location, but all to say that the Levites, according to Leviticus, according to Numbers, you have to be a Levite to be a priest, but you have to be more than that to be a priest. The Levite was like it's like saying you have to be a human to be a priest. So most of the Levites turned out to be very poor people. It seems like this has something to do with transitions of power, what the rise of the kingship. It says that when Jeroboam becomes king of the north, he got rid of all the Levites at the altars, and then they became poor, wandering people. Numbers says that the Aaronites, the sons of Aaron, are the real priests, and the Levites are poor people who help out and sometimes get scraps of food. Deuteronomy says the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the Levites need to be fed, which does not put them in like they're not an elevated group, right? So they're poor, but also Deuteronomy might reflect, and Leviticus might, like parts of it, we're not there yet, but parts of Leviticus might reflect this community, which seem to have remained important and kind of scholarly or knowledgeable, even in their displacement from sources of power. So the much more powerful group were the Aaronites, the sons of Aaron. That's who Leviticus talks about in chapters 1 through 16. They're the ones that get ordained. If you read Leviticus 8, read Leviticus 10, it's all about Aaron, all about Aaron. Only Aaron's sons can get ordained. No one else can get ordained, Levite or not. We know that there was a power struggle between the Aaronites and other priestly groups. If you remember, there's a story about how Aaron really messed up and Moses came and saved the day, the golden calf episode, which has deep links to the story of Jeroboam getting rid of the priests, and the golden calf, which shows up there, and then the golden bulls, which show up in the Jeroboam story. These are the gods who brought you out of Egypt, O Israel. There's the same quotation in 1 Kings 12 and in Exodus 32, the golden calf episode. All to say that there's some, like, we don't know all the details. We can't figure all this out, but there was some like real like power struggles between these different families and groups. And it seems like the Aaronites were the ones that won out, at least for a time, in the Jerusalem temple. Okay, so that's like a bunch of stuff in Leviticus, at least the chapters 1 through 16. We're going to get to the rest of it now, but let me just show you an outline. So Leviticus 1 through 16, that's what I've been talking about so far. We're going to get to the rest of it in 1 minute. This is all priestly and cultic matters. The ritual manual of ancient Israel, the rubric for their liturgy of sacrifice, all kinds of things you can say about this. This is written by for priests to be able to share with people in certain ways. And you can break this down. Leviticus 1 through 7, that's the manual of sacrifice. Leviticus 1 starts with burnt offerings, and that's all kinds of burnt offerings. It's like the general burnt offering thing. If you want to cook an animal, here's how you do it. And they explain the whole thing. And then you get particular offerings, the grain offerings. So if you look at Leviticus 2, you start to get the grain offerings. And Leviticus 2 says, when anyone presents a grain offering to the Lord, the offering shall be of choice flour. So grain is abundant and cheap in ancient Israel. It's the poor person's food. This is the poor person's offering. You got nothing else to give, bring some bread. The priest will take it. They'll bless you. This is okay. But it's, if you can afford more and you're not bringing more, that's a problem. So can't make any of it leavened as well. You can't use any leavening. Okay, so, and the priest is supposed to burn like a little corner of it, like so God can smell the bread, like, that's good bread. I like that cracker. But most of it the priest eats. So then the peace and well-being offering. So chapter 3, offerings of well-being. If everything's going great, everything's super cool, your life is wonderful, and you want to thank God for it, you can bring a sacrifice of well-being or shalom. This is a sacrifice of shalom, a peace offering or a well-being offering. Same word. Everything's great. Everything's peaceful. Everything's good. And this ends up being a big meal. You can have a big meal to thank God, and you can eat it, and the priest will eat it. And everything will be good. Then there's chapter 4. That is purification and sin offerings, and this goes into chapter 5. This is what I was talking about before, that ritual that we read. You'll often hear this as called sin offerings. I think they're called sin offerings in the NRSV. These are the ones that a lot of recent scholarship has said sin is not useful here. It's the word chatat, which is often translated as sin, but this is just impurity, ritual impurity. This is the ritual impurity stuff. This is nothing to do with like you're being a bad person or robbing someone or something like that. So if you mess up with ritual matters, this is how you take care of it. It's purification and sin offering. And then you have a shift. And in the NRSV, it's represented with a break, a line break after verse 13. And it says offerings with restitution. That means you're like restoring something. You're giving some people money or grain. Well, they didn't really have money. They should like silver or grain, or you're giving them something to make up for something you've done to them. So this is what we're looking at. And we're like, that's something's different here. And so these are often called guilt or reparation offerings. So this is like when you actually have done some moral problem. Now, it doesn't say if you killed someone. It does say this is like if you've taken something from someone. So it's like what we might think of as like petty crimes, right? This is petty crimes, petty moral issues. But you can take care of these, but it involves having a meal with the people that you've harmed. And then there's like a resumption. So starting with chapter 6, verse 8, there's a little heading there, instructions concerning sacrifices. It kind of goes back through all of them. And it tells it really more from the position of the priest rather than the position of the worshiper. And it kind of tells you a few more instructions about like what exactly you're supposed to do with these things. So it's another like a kind of rotation through. And then starting with verse 11 in chapter 7, further instructions. This is kind of more like someone has a question, like, what do we do about this? So like, who's supposed to touch this? What are we supposed to do with this part of the body? And like, the animal. So anyway, well, what parts do we eat? That's all handled at the end of chapter 7. So this is what we call the ritual manual of sacrifice. This is like chapters 1 through 7 is only about these sacrificial rituals where you're taking care of grain or sometimes incense, but mostly animals. So this is why we say though that sacrifice doesn't require death. It doesn't require blood. There are many of the rituals that do require blood, but grain offerings and incense offerings don't require blood, don't require death. So sacrifice is not primarily, not like can't reduce to death or blood. And it can't reduce to sin, because a lot of this doesn't have to do with like moral stuff. And it doesn't have to do with your own death. It doesn't have to do with Jesus's death. There's another way we can talk about that. So we'll get to that more in just a minute. Then the next section, if you go to chapter 8, Leviticus, you see the rites of ordination. So this is where you talk about getting ordained. Chapter 9 is Aaron actually getting ordained. And then chapter 10 is Nadab and Abihu, the kids that don't care and die. So this is a story about what it means to be ordained. It's kind of trying to scare you and say, no, you aren't just getting money from this. This is not just like a job. This is a vocation that actually messes with people's lives and can cause real problems. With that, right? I hope all of us who are thinking about ordination, right, realize that we are not just earning money, that this is actually people's lives that they are entrusting this with and their well-being. So Leviticus 8 through 10, ordination. And then Leviticus 11 through 15, that's the dietary laws, ritual purity, impurity. This is like the stuff like skin conditions, purity after childbirth, which animals are clean and unclean. That's all chapters 11 through 15. So that's our manual of purity, ritual purity, and ritual impurity. There's some rituals that take place in that section, etc. And then we have the chapter that sticks out, not really a part of P. Leviticus 16, older than P. This is a super old text. It doesn't really belong in Leviticus. In fact, it disagrees with a lot of what we've said about Leviticus already. The Day of Atonement ritual is bizarre. Bizarre for a number of reasons. Number one, it's the oldest ritual we know of in the world that is for a people. That actually happens for a people, to a people. Rituals in the ancient world, and the ancient Hittites, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, all the rituals were individual. And there's no atonement for a people. The people are not treated as an object until ancient Israel. In the same way, the earliest text we have in the history of the world that we know of, in which a people is addressed by a God, is Deuteronomy, you or y'all. Leviticus 16 is the earliest ritual we know of. Now, there's one other ritual that might be around the same time is from kind of Syria, basically. And there may be this might be like a regional thing where the people are actually treated as like a unit, not found in other ancient thought, because it would be dangerous to the king to treat the people as a unit. We, the people, does not exist in the ancient world outside of a few people around Israel and Israel. So Leviticus 16 is strange for that reason. And so you may, if they picked Leviticus 16, it interacts and intersects with what we've talked about so far, but it also stands a bit apart. Some of the ritual doesn't really work with some of the, it's because we think it's much older than P. We think this is pre-destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The whole stuff about Azazel, that's really weird. If you read the rest of Leviticus, you'll see that they don't blame stuff on demons. Azazel is definitely a demon, but it's a demon that they don't talk about. They just name it this one time and it's gone. They don't want you to think about it. And the reason seems to be that the priestly source doesn't want you to worship demons, which is what you would do if you thought there were demons in the world, in the ancient world. Everyone would sacrifice to demons to just make them go away. You're feeding them, you're asking them to like leave you alone. We have Hittite people, we have Egyptians, we have Mesopotamians who in their ritual books say, yeah, here's how you sacrifice to demons to make them go away. So that would happen in ancient Israel. They would sacrifice to demons all the time if the priest told them there's demons out there. So they don't say that because they don't want you to do that. They want you to focus on Yahweh as the one God. A strange idea in the ancient world, the singleness of Yahweh. And so here they're like, yeah, there's just a Azazel thing. You can almost feel how uncomfortable it makes them to mention it. But everyone knows that, everyone must have known, this must have been a big ritual. Everyone knew the Azazel stuff was there. So they had to put it in, but they also just pass over by it as if like whistling past the graveyard, like, they don't want you to think about it. Nonetheless, but the rest of the ritual is fascinating, right? The whole community is supposed to come together. Don't come to the sanctuary anytime, you'll die. But if you want to come inside the curtain, that is the Holy of Holies, that's before the mercy seat. Mercy seat just is the word Kippur, which means to cover, from the Yom Kippur, the covering. Mercy seat's a bit, it's like a Christian translation of it, really. So like the covering seat that's upon the ark, just the top of the ark. You can't come into that room or you'll just die. Because I'm there. God's just like sitting there, chilling in this room. And I'm so, it's like walking into a nuclear power plant and seeing the rods. You just be eviscerated immediately, right? So you can't do that. So Aaron should only come in this one day a year. God's going to get ready. God's going to like prepare for it. And you got to make sure you're super pure. You got to bathe in water. You got to clean all the ritual impurity off of you. And it says, verse 5, he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel. So this is for the congregation. It's for everyone in Israel. 2 male goats and a ram. And you're supposed to bring them inside. And then Aaron shall offer a bull for himself. So the priest has to take care of himself first, the high priest. Take care of himself first. And then he can go in. And then he has to do the whole Azazel scapegoat thing. And it's not that this is not about sin. This is about feeding a demon. That means and demons weren't all evil in the ancient world. The way they thought about these things were like they were tricksters. So just feed the trickster that hangs out in the desert and it's not going to eat you. That's all they say. So the scapegoat is not the one that has the hand placed on it. The scapegoat's like you're just feeding a demon. Like it doesn't take your sins anywhere. Your sins aren't a part of this. You're just literally feeding a demon. The unfortunate goat goes to be eaten by the demon. The goat that's lucky gets eaten by you. Anyway, so it gets into the wilderness. Now, does that goat just actually like live in the wilderness and just hang out there and have a good life? Maybe. So maybe that is the lucky goat. Then verse 11, Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself. So Aaron purifies himself with this massive offering just to make sure to cover himself because he's going into the most holy of spaces. He's got to be the most pure you can be. And then verse 12, he's going to take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar. He's going to like bring some of the fire from the altar in there. It's going to be incense. It's going to like kind of coat the room in a good smell, but also it's going to kind of protect him in a way like a cloud. And so then the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat. So it's supposed to kind of like make the room so you can't see anything so that he doesn't see God and then die because God is so powerful. And then he goes into the room. He takes some of the blood, sprinkles it on the mercy seat or the covering of the Ark of the Covenant. And he sprinkles it 7 times. He's going to put some blood on there. He's cleaning the most private place in God's house. And then he slaughters the goat inside the curtain, right? So he's bringing this blood inside the curtain, and he's going to be carefully kind of placing it and sprinkling it upon the mercy seat, cleaning off the sins of the people. And thus, verse 16, thus he shall make atonement, or Kippur, thus he shall cover the sanctuary because of the uncleannesses of the people of Israel and because of their transgressions. So here we have uncleanness and we have transgressions, which is like the word for sin. So this is why it's like, this probably takes care of like actual sins, and there's no specificity about it. So is this absolutely everything? I think so. But there are other people who say, like if you were in ancient Israel, you might like shy on the side of like, maybe this doesn't take care of anything, but everything. So this takes care of the uncleannesses of the people of Israel and takes care of their transgressions, all their sins of all kinds, both kinds, moral impurity and ritual impurity. And so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which remains with them in the midst of their uncleannesses. This is the tent of meeting where they were before they got to the temple, but this is like the temple in miniature. No one shall be in the tent of meeting from the time he makes the atonement, so no one else can be in there. And then verse 18, then he shall go out of the altar that is before the Lord. He shall leave the Holy of Holies and make atonement on its behalf, and he shall take some of the blood of the bull and the blood of the goat and put it on the horns of that altar that's out in the middle space. And then he shall sprinkle some of the blood and cleanse it and hallow it from the uncleanness of the people. And then when he's finished atoning for all the holy place, all the inside of the temple and the tent of meeting and the altar, so everything in the whole space, then he shall present the live goat. And then Aaron shall lay his hands on it and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins, putting them onto the head of the goat. This is the one time where we get maybe the sense that like the sins are kind of connected to the death of the animal in some way. But again, in the rest of the sacrifices, they look exactly like this, and they don't take care of sin, or death doesn't do something in particular. So all to say, putting them on the head of the goat and sending it away into the wilderness by means of someone designated for the task. The goat shall bear on itself all the iniquities to a barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. Now, this is a little bit separated from the part that we saw about Azazel. Aaron shall present the goat and send it out into the wilderness of Azazel. That's back in verse 10. So here's like two scapegoat ceremony things. One which has maybe some stuff about sin in it. The other one which doesn't seem to. Seems to just have to do with the demon. So are these two different ceremonies? Is this one ceremony? People will argue about this. But then Aaron shall enter the tent of meeting, take the linen vestments, and you go to the holy place. Notice that the goat that may, if you want to make an argument that this goat actually takes away the sins of the people, that one doesn't die.
Yes.
Weird, because in a Christian way of thinking about sacrifice, generally it's that one should be the one that dies because Jesus took all this, right? So this is interesting question. We'll get to this in a minute. But yeah, so then verse 29. So at verse 29, this shall be a statute to you forever. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall deny yourselves and shall do no work, either the citizen or the alien who resides among you. For on this day, so this is like a little Sabbath, right? It's a rest from work. For on this day, atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you from all of your sins or all of your impurities. You shall be clean or pure before the Lord. So it's that same word, impurity, sin, clean, pure. It is a Sabbath or a rest, of complete rest to you. So no work. You shall deny yourselves. So don't like have a lot of fun. It's actually a day of like trying to think about your life and take things seriously. So it's not just to like play sports, but it's a day to get real with yourself. So there's other rituals that have emerged in Judaism to think about this, like tashlik, where you write things down, you put them in a river and kind of send away things you've done that are bad, or try to make amends with people. And then the priest who is anointed and consecrated, verse 32, as a priest in his father's place shall make atonement, wearing the linen vestments, the holy vestments, and he shall make atonement for the sanctuary. He shall make atonement for the tent of meeting, for the altar. He shall make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. So every person is a part of this ceremony. There should be an everlasting statute for you to make atonement for the people of Israel once a year for all their sins or all their impurities. And Moses did as he was commanded. So there's our Day of Atonement. This may be the one they pick. Maybe it's not, but I would encourage you to take a look at commentaries if they do. So that one sticks out a little bit, is a little bit unusual, a little bit different. And then the last part of Leviticus is the holiness code. Now I got a new kind of slide for this, but if you back up here to the very bottom of our screen, but Leviticus 17 through 26 is the holiness code, or H. Now the holiness code is radically different from the priestly materials. We think it's later. We think it's maybe the Levites that have to do with this rather than the priests and sons of Aaron. The reason is it has a totally different understanding of what holiness is and how it works. And the refrain happens again and say to all the congregation, be holy, for I, Yahweh, your God, am holy. Be holy, for I, Yahweh, your God, am holy. Leviticus 19:2. The word holy occurs all the time here. So there's a difference in terms of holy space. In P, in the priestly source, only the sanctuary is holy. Only the sanctuary is holy as a space. Everything else is common. In H, you get these weird statements that the whole land is supposed to be holy. Everything's supposed to be holy. It's unusual. It's very different. It disagrees. And then in terms of people, in P, only the priests are holy, everyone else is common. But in H, they say every single person should be holy and might not be, which is weird because if you, in P, in the priestly way of thinking, if you are holy, that means you got ordained. That means you're from a certain family, you're of a certain age. H says every single person should be holy, but might not be. Like it's a thing you can acquire, regardless of your identity, regardless of your birth, age. It's a weird, like you can't just become holy in P. In H, it's a status you can acquire. And then, can holiness change? In P, no. If you become holy, you're ordained, you can't get unordained. You got to live the rest of your life and try to, like, you know, take care of purity, you know, like you're just holy. And holy days are holy. You can't like undo the holy day. You can't like change the Day of Atonement. It's done because God said it. Common things, they're just common. Like there's no way that I, a common person, can like achieve holiness. Unless I'm from a certain family, from a certain background. I knew I was going to get to that point. There's certain places, certain things, but it's not open to everybody. H always says that holiness changes, like it says it throughout. Like you can gain it, you can lose it, you can mess with it. Holiness status changes over time, of place, of people, of things, and sanctification or the process of becoming holy is a process. It's not just a ritual that happens at a certain time like P. This is like a lifelong thing. And unholiness, the opposite of holiness, like I said for P, like unholiness means common. It's not bad, it's not wrong. And then ritual impurity, if there is ritual impurity, it's not unholy. It's just impurity, but that can be cleansed with rituals or time, generally. In H, unholiness is pollution. It's bad. Like everything should be holy. If it's not holy, that's a problem. And it's moral evil for things to be unholy. And there's no ritual to help this. In H, like if you start with Leviticus 17 and you read all the way, like they talk about blood, they talk about rituals, but they don't say that like you can't get holiness through rituals. You can't sacrifice your way into holiness. It's a moral status. That's to do with how you love and treat other people. You need to love your neighbor as yourself. That's Leviticus 19. You need to love the alien as yourself. That's Leviticus 19. That's a path to holiness. As if holiness has not to do with just ontological status, like what you are, but it has to do with like how you live. So we have arguments in the Christian community between people who are Wesleyan and believe that you can become holy and that holiness is a process and it can be earned over time or it can be lost. And then we have people who say, no way, holiness is something that is like God's alone and saints are just everybody, depending on whether you believe or not, right? So you have Reformed folks versus Wesleyan folks. Reformed folks like P, Wesleyan folks like H. So that's to say, like, I mean, every Christian community finds its own way of like rooting itself. The Catholic community tends and Orthodox tend to root themselves more in H than in P. In some things, the Catholic Church is big about P. You can only be a priest, but everyone can be a priest, well, except if you're a man. But if you're, you know, that is to say, like they have like, they're much more open than like, they have a much more H version of holiness because priests could tell you to be holy. I went to Catholic school, they told me to be holy, but they also would say, well, you can't become a priest. That's a special kind of holiness, unless you become a priest, but then you got to go through the process. So there's kind of a mixture in some Christian communities of P and H in terms of sanctification or holiness. How do you become sancta? How do you become holy? So Reformed folks tend to fall more towards P, like Presbyterians. Wesleyan, Methodist folks, other Wesleyan communities tend to fall more, Pentecostals tend to fall more in the H category. And then other communities can kind of find themselves on the spectrum between these at some point. So if we look at that part of Leviticus then, let's just recap Leviticus 1 through 15, really. That's that priestly cultic manual. 1 through 7 is the manual of sacrifice. 8 through 10 is ordination. 11 through 15 is all those laws about purity and impurity. And then 16 was that weird Day of Atonement. It kind of sticks out. It does some stuff that the other rituals don't do. At the same time, it is bizarre because it talks about Azazel and just envisions the space differently. It seems to come from a different world. Nonetheless, it seemed to have been super important to all the people, so the priest had to keep it in. And then we have the holy. I mean, I think they would have kept it in anyway, but they have to leave some of the stuff in that's uncomfortable for them. But then we have this other book that seems to have been added later, Leviticus 17 through 26, that might have been written to try to undo Leviticus 1 through 15, but both of them got combined into one text and were passed down like that. And this is the Holiness Code. So Holiness code starts with rules about blood. So 17 is like the beginning of it, transitioning from the Day of Atonement. The Lord spoke to Moses, speak to Aaron and his sons and all the people of Israel and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. So yeah, talk to those priests of Aaron, but talk to everyone and tell them this is what everyone should do. Don't do these things. They're given like the laws about blood to everyone. And then verse 7, look at verse 7 of chapter 17 of Leviticus. So that they may no longer offer their sacrifices for goat demons. That's Azazel. Don't do the Azazel stuff anymore, Leviticus 17 says, because that's bad. It's like worshiping another god. Don't just, I know it's in there, just don't do it, is what they say. That's what they're trying to say. And they say it's prostitute. That's not actually the word there. The word there is zonah. It's foreign or strange. It's a foreign or strange practice. In other words, you're worshiping another god. Don't do that. So all to say, that's why I say that like the one ritual that seems to have to do with like putting sin onto an animal and sending it away, they tell you in Leviticus, please don't do that. Like, don't do the goat stuff. Just sacrifice the goat normally on the altar. Okay, so then you get eating blood prohibited because blood is a life force. They're like reiterating some of the stuff we see in Leviticus, but making it more clear. Why would they have to like clarify what blood is and what it does? Because everyone's got to care about these rules, not just priests. Everyone's supposed to be holy. And then chapter 18, we get a lot about sex. Sex has to do with procreation, has to do with life, has to do with the generation of new life and new humans. That's why it's important to these folks. It has to do with holiness because God makes life. So we got to be careful about how we treat our life-making stuff. They do it in ways that we would not imagine, in part because they come from a different culture. So what we can say, if we have to exegete a part of this, is to say ancient culture dealt with sex, gender, all kinds of issues having to do with sexual relations in a different way than we might think of today. It's culturally situated. Nonetheless, we can ask the question, how can we today think about the principle that is kind of in Leviticus 18 and 19 about sex? How can we think about sex in a way that is holy, that respects, that is kind of culturally embedded for us, right? How does this work for us to think about life? How does this lead to the value of life, the positivity of life? That's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to, I mean, part of this is like, don't molest your kids. Like literally Leviticus 18 is trying to say stuff like that. Don't seduce someone that is your neighbor who is married, right? Don't mess with people's lives by using sex. So that's part of what this is about. And then there's some stuff that stuff about that's used as what we call clobber verses in here about sexuality, and they might give one of those. Right? If they give one of those, the way to think about it would be, what's the value that's being described in this culturally embedded context of the ancient world? The value is about life, and it's about treating other people with respect. And there's all kinds of ways we can translate those clobber verses. It's not about my two gay friends live down the street. It is not about the guys with the Pomeranian that live behind me. It's not about them. This is about like taking advantage of a servant, most likely, and using them sexually. So we can think in other ways about how we might implement these kinds of teachings in our own day and age in such a way that we are respecting the intent or the principle behind some of these laws about sexuality. So just a thought. So then if you like hurt other people using sex, that's basically the idea. If you hurt other people using sex, then chapter 18, verse 28, then the land will vomit you out for defiling it. So the land is supposed to be pure. If you hurt other people sexually, the land will literally vomit you out because you aren't worthy of it. The land is good. It's holy. And so then chapter 19, speak to all the congregation, every single person, and say, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You're supposed to be holy like God is. And you're like, what? God's a nuclear reactor. How am I supposed to be a nuclear reactor? Well, you were made in the image of God. So you got this, you're like a fire hose of nuclear radioactivity. So you got to get used to it. That's the way that the H sees it. P does not see it this way. It's a development that takes place over time. We can see that Ezekiel seems to be somebody who moves in the direction of H from P. So this might be a change or a shift that happens in the time of the exile because priests couldn't be ordained and they couldn't sacrifice in exile. There's no sacrifice. There's no, nothing's clean. Everything's impure. So they had to shift the purity system from a ritual one to a moral one. And so Leviticus, the H code is really all about how you treat other people. And are you treating them in a way that brings life and not death? And that is the key to being holy. And that's the call for everyone, not just priests. So Chapter 19, verse 18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. Doesn't sound like the rest of Leviticus. That's very different. It's a legal code. You shall not render unjust judgment, verse 15. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. So treat people with justice. With justice, you shall judge your neighbor. And don't profit by any blood, or don't hurt people. And then verse 33, chapter 19, verse 33. When an alien resides among you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides among you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. First of all, this is borrowing from Exodus 22. This is somebody's read Exodus. Somebody's read Deuteronomy, and they're combining them. And they're putting them into a priestly manual. So whoever wrote H has got access to something like the Torah. It's not the Torah yet, but it's like a preview. It's a what do they call that when the restaurant opens only for family and friends? It's a preview night of the Torah, and they got a little access to it. But then they got to add in this this H part, right? And so this is trying to, in a way, like bring together all of these different principles of justice, of loving the foreigner as yourself, of treating people with justice and respect because that's who Yahweh is, and combining that with the idea of holiness, which is not found in Deuteronomy as much, not found in Exodus as much, at least in the first part of Exodus. The P material starts in the second part of Exodus, but in that first part of Exodus where you find the covenant code, you really don't find discussion of holiness. So then we've got other stuff. So it's rule about blood, call to holiness. That goes all the way through chapter 22, but you got holiness of priests in chapter 21. So priests are still holy in H, but so is everyone. And then the use of holy offerings and acceptable offerings. They're still talking about ritual stuff, but now it's mixed in with daily life according to H. And then you get the appointed festivals. This is in Leviticus. So P doesn't have this here. P has it in Numbers 28 and 29. Here in Leviticus, chapters 23, and then it goes into kind of 25 with the sabbatical year, but 23 is the main section of the rituals. This disagrees a little bit with the rituals that you find in Numbers in 28, 29. It's different stages in time. The religion has changed a bit. This is probably the second temple period, so things are going to be different from the first temple period, but there's a lot of similarities. But so you'll find differences between Leviticus 23 and then P's rituals that it talks about in Numbers 28 and 29. Then you get, some of the holy time stuff. It goes all the way through the Jubilee, right? The sabbatical year, that's chapter 25, the Jubilee, where you're supposed to set people free. And basically, H does away with slavery of local people, of Israelites. There are no Israelite slaves or no Judahite slaves anymore in the holiness code. This is a change from Exodus and from Deuteronomy. There's kind of a shift in that way. There are still regulations about foreign people that could be sold and bought according to these regulations. So they're not there yet in terms of liberation, but they're moving along a path and they're recognizing the requirement, the necessity of Jubilee, of freedom. So there's a way to get back your land, the idea that God gave you land and everyone's supposed to have a piece of land that they can live on. So it's a democratic, again, kind of a way of thinking about land and about access. And then we got the blessings and curses in chapter 26, which is the same way that Deuteronomy ends. And there's a little bit of this at the end of the covenant code in Exodus as well. So how you end a law code? You end a law code with, hey, here are the good things if you do these things, and here are the bad things if you don't do these things. So that's why I say H is a law code. It's a law code like Deuteronomy. It's a law code like an Exodus. It's not like P's ritual manual. And then chapter 27, that's the weird appendix. Chapter 27 is just kind of like extra stuff. Some stuff about vows. And it sounds like more like it's P, but there's some stuff about Jubilee in there too. So it's a mixed bag of sources and stuff. Okay, I know it's 5:36. I know we're late. I want to have a time for questions, and then I'll mercifully end us. But does anyone have any questions or comments about Leviticus? I got two sides real quick, just to think about New Testament. Sorry, I forgot about these. Sacrifice isn't about substitution. Sacrifice isn't about death, fundamentally. Sacrifice isn't about suffering. The animals need to suffer. It's not about your suffering. It's not about moral impurity, fundamentally. That should be a 4. Yeah, sacrifice isn't fundamentally about moral impurity. It's fundamentally about ritual impurity, according to P. What sacrifice is, it's about restoring community with our neighbors. It's about purifying the holy space and making it possible to have communion with God. And it's about restoring that communion with God both through our gifts, through our reconciliation with our neighbors, and through our taking care of God's space and cleaning up our messes. So if we think about the New Testament, I've put a couple of books on the suggested list that deal with the New Testament ramifications of this. So a lot of the ways we've been told to read the New Testament, if you read them with these, like with this notion, with this sensibility about priestly materials and P&H, you will read them differently. So Matthew Thiessen has a book about Jesus and the forces of death. His argument is that impurity and sin is about death, literally the power of death that's trying to fight with the power of life. That's God's purity. And you can see this in the New Testament, that Jesus isn't trying to like hurt people. Jesus is trying to like fight against the forces of death and save people. And so it's a ritual thing. That's why leprosy is such a big deal in Jesus's stories, the pure and impure stuff. And it's not about the people being bad. It's about Jesus fighting the forces of death and saving people. Also, Hebrews is so important in these matters. Like, I mean, it thinks about Jesus as a sacrifice, but not because Jesus paid for our sins with his blood, because Jesus gave himself. He's a mediator, and he now is doing sacrifices in heaven on our behalf, according to Hebrews. The Gospels, when they talk about Jesus and our sins, there's other ways to read these texts. Andrew Riera, Rillera, has a book called The Lamb of the Free. Excellent book. I don't agree with all of it, but it's really wonderful, very clearly done. Lays out Jacob Milgram's argument in the first part of the book. The second part of the book is, so what about Jesus? And he ends up showing that like Jesus has a lot to say about sacrifice in the New Testament that sounds a lot like he just read Leviticus. And in fact, when the New Testament authors talk about Jesus's death and Jesus' resurrection, it seems like this stuff about Jesus, like it's a lot more about restoring communion with God and with neighbor than it is about Jesus' suffering and agony on the cross, somehow paying for my sin in my place, substitutionary. So if you read it with that light. So those are great resources for what may happen on the ordination exam, which is they may ask you, so what about the New Testament? What about Jesus? What about here's a text from Luke where they talk about Jesus and sin and death. What do you do with this? It might be a good idea to check with Andrew Riera's book, Lamb of the Free. The first 2 chapters are all about Leviticus and how that, and then the rest of the book's about like, so what about the New Testament? So you can find probably in the scripture index in the back, the part where he talks about the story that they're asking you to deal with, possible. Also, Matthew Thiessen's book, Jesus and the Forces of Death, another one that is a great, they've got them on reserve, I think, over at the library. There might be online versions of reserves, and there are other ways to find books online. So questions, comments, concerns? It's a lot, I know. Yeah, AJ, got any questions? Daniel, son, James?
I'm good. Just that I will request that maybe if the recording will be made available for us.
Yes. There's a list that you have. Is that Susan? I'll send a link to the recording to the student services office, and they'll put it out. And then I'll also send it. I'll send it to Susan and the other folks that I see on this call. I'll try to include you all in an email, but there might be other folks who want it as well. I think student services was taking information from folks. So we'll try to get it to you a number of different ways. Thanks, son.
Awesome.
All
Yeah,
right.
no questions for me. Just thank you very much for all of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope it gives you some stuff to think about in terms of theology, AJ. Some good questions. You doing all right, man?
Yeah, doing good.
Sounds good. Yeah. All right. Well, good to see y'all. If you think of other questions, feel free to email.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to end the meeting. I'll see y'all. God bless on your ordination, becoming a holy person.